My son said, "Get on your knees if you want to stay." The words hit me like a winter wind, cutting through a cracked window pane, cold and unforgiving, leaving nothing but the sharp sting of disbelief and a growing ache in my chest. I didn't expect such cruelty from him, not from the boy whose small hand I once held tightly as he took his first steps, the same hand I carefully guided through life's early confusion and challenges. I kicked the chair out from under him, not literally, because that would have been a physical act of rebellion I was too weary to commit, but in my mind, in that quiet, fierce moment, I pushed back against the weight of his command with all the strength my body and spirit could muster. It was the breaking point of years of subtle erosion, the culmination of silences and sideways glances, of being shuffled into corners and forgotten rooms. Now, at 78 years old, I find myself living alone in a small, dimly lit room of a boarding house that overlooks a narrow alley framed by the skeletal branches of winter trees, a place I chose because it offers quiet and distance from the wounds of my past, a place where I can finally breathe without the burden of being unseen or unheard. I wasn't always alone. For decades, my life was intertwined with the lives of my children and grandchildren, a tapestry woven from the threads of shared memories, family dinners, and the steady rhythm of caregiving and love, or at least what I believed was love. But that tapestry began to unravel slowly, thread by thread, until it was little more than frayed edges and empty spaces. I remember the winter evening when I first felt the coldest chill of rejection, not just in my bones, but in the way my son looked at me, a look that carried the weight of unspoken words and long-held resentments. I had come to stay with them after a fall had made my small home too difficult to manage, trusting that their arms would catch me when I stumbled, that their walls would shelter me from loneliness. Instead, I found their home rearranged to exclude me, a place where my presence was a problem to be managed, a burden to be hidden away behind polite smiles and whispered conversations. The furniture shifted, the air grew thinner, and the smiles never quite reached their eyes. The phrase, "Get on your knees if you want to stay," was not just a command, but a verdict, a final judgment passed in the dim light of their kitchen, while other family members buzzed around, unaware or unwilling to intervene. It was a moment that crystallized everything I had begun to suspect, but dared not fully acknowledge. The truth that I was no longer welcome, that my existence in their lives was conditional upon my submission, my silence, my invisibility. Yet, despite the humiliation and the sting of betrayal, I understood that this was not simply about one harsh phrase or one bitter night. It was the inevitable result of years spent bending to others' wills, of sacrifices made without thanks, of my identity being slowly dissolved into the shadows cast by their convenience and discomfort. I recall the early days of that winter with vivid clarity, the way the light fell through the curtains in the mornings, the muffled sounds of life happening around me as I sat quietly in a corner of the living room, a ghost in a house filled with noise. I was allowed the guest room, which felt more like a holding cell than a refuge, cold and sterile, with walls painted an unforgiving white, and a bed dressed in linen so thin it offered no comfort. My belongings were reduced to a small suitcase, which I unpacked and packed again in a daily ritual that seemed to mark time more than settle into a home. The kitchen table, once a place of warmth and laughter, became a battleground of clipped sentences and withheld glances. My attempts to join conversations were met with polite nods or sudden distractions. I learned to speak softly, to move like a shadow, to keep my needs hidden behind a smile that masked the growing ache of isolation. In those months, I was a presence that needed to be managed. My medication was sorted without my input. My favorite chair replaced by a folding stool deemed more practical. Family photos were rearranged so that I was no longer in them. Pictures that once captured moments of joy, erased or hidden behind other frames. The quietest cruelties were the hardest to bear. The absence of my name in conversations, the deliberate forgetting of my birthday, the subtle tightening of control over my movements and choices. Even my granddaughter, once eager to curl up beside me with a book or a drawing, stopped visiting my room, her visits reduced to quick hellos in passing. The house, once a place I thought I belonged to, had transformed into a gallery of exclusion. And yet I held on, perhaps because giving up felt like losing a piece of myself I wasn't ready to surrender. Perhaps because hope, stubborn and flickering, kept me tethered to the belief that this was temporary, that beneath the coldness, beneath the dismissal, there was still love waiting to be rediscovered. I remembered the days when I baked scones for their birthdays, when my hands wiped tears from scraped knees, when my voice read bedtime stories long after my own eyes grew heavy with sleep. I clung to the memories as a lifeline, a secret garden where I could retreat when the world grew too harsh. But that night, when my son uttered those words, the fragile threads of hope snapped. It was not just a call to submission. It was a demand for erasure. To get on my knees was to admit defeat, to disappear beneath the weight of their expectations and shame. And in that moment, I felt something inside me break free. I realized that I would not comply. I would not shrink into the shadow they wished me to be. The chair, though absent in the physical sense, became a symbol of resistance. Kicking it out from under him was an act of reclaiming dignity, of refusing to be small. Since then, I have lived apart from them, navigating the quiet spaces of independence and rediscovery. My room in this boarding house may be modest and overlooked, but it is mine. The window, though dirty and streaked with rain, lets in a sliver of light I welcome every morning. Here, I am learning to breathe without apology, to hold my own name without hesitation, to remember who I am beyond the roles assigned to me by family or society. The journey has been lonely and at times unbearably painful, but it is also a journey toward freedom, toward a life chosen rather than endured. I am not bitter, though the scars remain. I speak of this not to seek sympathy, but to tell the truth of a woman who is both invisible and indomitable. My story is one of quiet rebellion, of finding strength in silence, of reclaiming a life that was almost lost to the shadows of expectation and neglect. If this reaches another woman who feels unseen, unheard, or unworthy, know this: your voice matters. Your place is not defined by the acceptance of others, but by the courage to stand, even when the ground beneath you shakes. And sometimes standing means kicking away the chair that tries to hold you down. The moment when everything shifted was not marked by a grand confrontation or an explosive argument, but by a quiet, deliberate act that shattered the fragile illusion I had clung to for so long. It was a cold evening in late November, the sky a dull gray that seemed to press down on the city like a weight. I had been living with my son and his family for several months by then, ostensibly as a temporary arrangement while I recovered from my fall. Each day I tried to convince myself that things would improve, that my presence was tolerated out of love or duty, and that one day I would be welcomed not just as a guest, but as a mother and grandmother again. But the reality was a slow, relentless erosion of my dignity. And that evening, it culminated in a moment of raw cruelty that I will never forget. The house was filled with the hum of preparations for a dinner party. My daughter-in-law moved briskly through the rooms, arranging plates and glasses with a precision that left no room for mistakes or interruptions. My son paced near the kitchen doorway, his face tight with impatience. I sat quietly in the living room, clutching a worn shawl around my shoulders, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. The children were upstairs, their laughter muffled but faintly audible, a cruel reminder of the life that was continuing without me, fully part of it. I thought about rising to help, to set the table or pour drinks, but a glance from my son stopped me, a look that said, without words, that I was neither needed nor welcome. Then, when the chatter had died down and the other guests had arrived, the inevitable moment came. My son found me in the kitchen, standing by the counter as I washed a few glasses left over from the afternoon. His voice was low but firm, the kind of voice that commands obedience rather than invites conversation. "Get on your knees if you want to stay," he said. There was no humor in it, no softness, just the cold edge of finality. It was a demand wrapped in a command, a line drawn in the sand that I was expected to cross if I wanted to remain in their home, in their lives. The words stunned me at first, reverberating through my mind, like a bell tolling in an empty church. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, to shake my head in disbelief, to ask if he truly meant what he said. But there was no space for such reactions. The room was filled with the muffled voices of the guests in the other room, the clinking of silverware, the faint strains of music. No one else seemed to hear, or if they did, they chose silence. I was alone in that moment, with the weight of his words pressing down on me like a stone. I considered complying, just to keep the peace, to avoid the embarrassment that would surely follow if I refused. But something deep inside me rebelled. I thought of all the years I had devoted to raising him, to building a home for our family, to supporting dreams and wiping tears. I thought of the sacrifices I had made quietly, without complaint, the countless ways I had bent and bowed to keep the family together. And now, after all that, this was the price of staying: humiliation and submission. Instead of lowering myself as he demanded, I straightened my back and looked him in the eye with a steadiness that surprised even me. The chair he had pushed toward me, the cheap folding kind that symbolized how little they valued my comfort, I kicked out from under him, not physically, but in that silent act of defiance that said, "I will not be small." The room seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, I was certain he would yell or push back, but he only stared, as if seeing me for the first time, or perhaps realizing that the mother he thought he could control had quietly become a stranger he no longer recognized. After that night, the dynamics in the house shifted irreversibly. I was no longer a family member, but a problem to be managed. My presence was tolerated at best, and often met with impatience or avoidance. The dinners became more rushed, the conversations more guarded, the rooms I was allowed to occupy smaller and colder. My movements were scrutinized, my belongings minimized, my stories dismissed as irrelevant. Even the children, once warm and curious, grew distant, mirroring the attitudes of the adults around them. The catalyst was not a single act of violence, but the culmination of countless small betrayals, moments of erasure and neglect that combined to create a wall I could no longer climb. It was in the way my son would answer my questions with clipped phrases, the way my daughter-in-law would speak over me in conversations, the way my name was left out of family plans and invitations. It was the silent message that I was an obstacle to be tolerated rather than a person to be cherished. In the weeks that followed, I began to withdraw, not out of defeat, but as a way to protect the fragile core of myself that remained. I spent more time in my room, reading old letters and photographs, remembering who I was before I became invisible. I found solace in small routines, a cup of tea made just so, the soft hum of the radio in the early morning, the feel of sunlight through the window. These became acts of quiet resistance, small ways to hold on to my identity in a world that seemed determined to erase it. One afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the leaves fall in the backyard, I realized that the life I had known with my family was no longer possible. The invitation to get on my knees was not just a cruel joke, but a clear signal that my place was no longer with them. It was a painful truth to accept, but accepting it also sparked a resolve I had not felt in years. I would not disappear quietly. I would find a way to reclaim my life on my own terms. The catalyst that night did not just expose the fracture in our relationship. It revealed my own strength. In the face of rejection, I found the courage to stand. In the shadow of betrayal, I discovered a flicker of hope. Though the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with loneliness, it was mine to walk. And walking it meant leaving behind the expectations, the hurt, and the silence that had defined too many years. That evening was a turning point, a moment when the old story ended and a new one began, one written not by the hands of those who sought to control me, but by my own. It was the moment I chose to stop waiting for permission, to stop hoping for acceptance, and to start choosing myself. After the night my son delivered that cruel ultimatum, life did not immediately transform in a dramatic or obvious way. There were no fiery arguments or doors slammed in my face. Instead, the change crept into my existence like a slow, relentless fog that gradually swallowed everything familiar and safe. The first escalation of my isolation unfolded not in grand gestures, but in the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts that chipped away at my presence and my sense of belonging until I became a shadow among the living. It was in the quiet rearrangement of our lives, the silences that hung longer than before, and the gentle but firm walls that rose between me and the family I had once known so intimately. In the days following that evening, I noticed the smallest things begin to disappear, or more accurately, to be taken away from me under the guise of practicality and care. My favorite mug, the one with the delicate floral pattern that I had used for years, was suddenly nowhere to be found. When I asked about it, my daughter-in-law smiled politely but without warmth and said it was put away for safekeeping because it was fragile and didn't fit with their new kitchen aesthetic. It was a small thing, but it felt like a quiet message. The things I loved, the things that marked me, were no longer considered important in this house. My belongings were minimized bit by bit, packed into boxes, or relegated to the back of cabinets, out of sight and out of mind. Meals, once the lively heart of our family, became mechanical affairs. The dinner table was set without me, conversations carefully steered away from topics I might want to contribute to, my presence acknowledged only when necessary. I learned to listen quietly, to let the words wash over me without reaching in to claim space or share my own stories. I watched my son's eyes flicker away when I tried to make a point, the way his smile would tighten as if I had said something unwelcome. The effort to belong became exhausting. The old, familiar rituals of family life turned into performances in which I was a guest star, whose lines were often forgotten or cut. The children, once the bright lights of my days, began to mirror the adults around them in their avoidance. My granddaughter, who had once loved to curl up beside me with a book or a drawing, stopped coming to my room. Her visits became brief and infrequent, replaced by hurried hellos on the way past or whispered phone calls I was no longer included in. I saw the change in her eyes, not out of malice, but perhaps out of confusion and loyalty to the world she was growing into. a world where I no longer seemed to have a place. The house felt less like a home and more like a stage where I was expected to play a part that did not include genuine connection or affection. There was a tightening of control over even the smallest aspects of my life. My medication, once managed with my input, was now organized and dispensed without my consent. Pills were counted and distributed on a schedule that suited their routines rather than mine. I was told it was for my own good, a form of care disguised as control. The pantry cabinets were locked, the keys held by my daughter-in-law, who said it was to prevent confusion and to keep the household running smoothly. The allowance I received from my pension, which I had always managed carefully, was now helped by them, with money given to me in smaller, controlled amounts, as if I could no longer be trusted with my own finances. These actions were framed as kindnesses, but to me, they felt like cages, small but unyielding, designed to confine rather than to nurture. Even the language used around me changed. My name became a rarity in conversation, replaced by vague references like the old lady or mom when she's around. Invitations to family events stopped arriving, or if they did, they were couched in conditional terms that made me hesitate. I was told about gatherings after they had occurred, or asked not to come because it would be easier for everyone. The cumulative effect of these omissions was a profound loneliness that settled in my bones, a quiet grief for the life that was slipping away while I sat watching from the sidelines. In the background of this growing invisibility, I was still expected to perform the roles I had played for decades: the caretaker, the keeper of memories, the one who cooked holidays' meals and tended to scraped knees, even as my own needs were ignored or dismissed. There was no recognition of the toll this erasure took on me, no space for my pain or my anger. I learned to mask my hurt behind a practiced smile and gentle words, to absorb the unspoken message that to fight or complain was to risk further exclusion. The slow, steady diminishment of my presence became a war of attrition, waged in the spaces between words and the quiet denial of my worth. Yet, even as the walls closed in, a small, stubborn part of me resisted. I clung to the fragments of my identity that remained. My love for a certain cup of tea brewed just right in the morning, the way I still folded my clothes with care, the soft, worn pages of an old book I kept tucked under my pillow. These were my acts of quiet rebellion, small sanctuaries in the midst of encroaching silence. Each morning I dressed with deliberate care, choosing a scarf or a sweater that reminded me of better days, reminding myself that I was more than the sum of the dismissals and absences. The emotional weight of this slow erasure pressed heavily on me, sometimes manifesting in restless nights and a tightening in my chest that no medicine could soothe. I found myself retreating into memories, both sweet and painful, tracing the contours of a life before invisibility, before the day my son asked me to get on my knees. I remembered the laughter of children, the warmth of family gatherings, the feeling of belonging to something greater than myself. These recollections were bittersweet. They reminded me of what I had lost, but also of who I was beneath the layers of neglect and rejection. In the midst of this growing isolation, the practical realities of my situation became clearer. I was living in a house that no longer felt like home, surrounded by people who had grown distant and wary of my presence. The kindnesses I had hoped for were few and far between, replaced by a polite but firm boundary that kept me at arm's length. I began to understand that the first escalation was not a moment, but a process, a slow, deliberate shifting of roles and relationships that relegated me to the margins of my own life. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself thinking more and more about what it meant to belong and what it meant to be left out. I pondered the difference between presence and absence, between being physically there and truly being seen. The house, once filled with the sounds of shared stories and laughter, now echoed with silence and half-spoken sentences. I realized that I was being erased, not with words or violence, but with absence and neglect, a form of moral violence that cut deeper than any shout or slap. This first escalation was both heartbreaking and clarifying. It forced me to confront the reality that I could no longer depend on the family that had once been my world. It made me aware of the urgent need to reclaim my own space, my own voice, and my own life. Though the loneliness was profound, it sparked within me a quiet determination, a seed of resolve that would grow in the months to come. The slow march of erasure became a catalyst for awakening, a painful but necessary step toward freedom. I began to observe more keenly, to listen not just to the words spoken, but to the silences, the looks exchanged behind my back, the changes in tone and behavior. I noted how the house was rearranged, not for my comfort, but for the convenience of others. I watched as my stories were dismissed, my opinions ignored, and my presence tolerated only when convenient. Each small act of exclusion added up to a mosaic of abandonment, painted not with harsh strokes, but with the quiet colors of neglect. And yet, within this quiet storm, I found moments of unexpected grace. Sometimes in the stillness of early morning or late at night, I would catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror, a woman who had endured much and yet still held on. I saw the lines on my face not just as marks of age, but as maps of resilience and survival. I felt the steady beat of my heart as a reminder that I was still here, still capable of choosing, still worthy of love and respect. The first escalation was the slow unraveling of a life I had thought secure, but it was also the beginning of a journey back to myself. It revealed the fractures in my family and in my own sense of identity, but it also ignited a quiet fire that would not be extinguished. In the face of erasure and invisibility, I began to find my voice again, not in loud declarations or angry confrontations, but in the small, steady acts of reclaiming my space, my dignity, and my right to be. This part of the story is not just about loss, but about awakening, the painful but powerful realization that to survive, I must first see myself clearly and refuse to be diminished. It is the moment when I begin to understand that the path forward will require strength, patience, and a willingness to stand alone if necessary. And it is the foundation on which the rest of my story will be built. The moment that marked the true turning point in my story was not heralded by a grand epiphany or a dramatic confrontation, but by a quiet realization that began to take root deep inside me, like the first tentative shoots of spring pushing through the cold, unyielding earth after a long, harsh winter. It was during one of the many evenings I spent alone in the guest room of my son's house, a room that felt more like a cell than a refuge, where the walls seemed to close in with every passing day, and the silence was so thick it pressed against my ears. I sat there, clutching an old photograph of my late husband and me on our wedding day, the edges worn and the colors faded, but the smiles still vivid and full of promise. It was in that quiet, solitary moment that I began to see beyond the shadow of rejection and neglect that had enveloped me for so long, and to glimpse a possibility of reclaiming my life, not as an afterthought or a burden, but as a woman who still had the strength to choose her own path. The catalyst for this shift came in the form of a forgotten piece of paper I found tucked away in a drawer, yellowed with age, but still legible. It was the deed to the house my late husband and I had purchased together decades ago, a document I had long assumed was lost or irrelevant. As I traced the familiar signatures and dates, a surge of clarity washed over me. Despite the years of absence and the subtle erasure of my presence in the family home, my name was still there, etched in legal ink alongside my husband's, a testament to a claim I had never relinquished. This simple truth was a lifeline, a tangible proof that I had not been as invisible or powerless as I had been made to feel. It was a reminder that I had once held, and could still hold, a stake in the foundation of this family and my own life. Armed with this knowledge, I began to plan quietly, deliberately. The decision was not born of anger or revenge, but of a deep, steady resolve to reclaim my dignity and autonomy. I understood that the journey ahead would not be easy, that the path to freedom often winds through loneliness and uncertainty, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope that was strong enough to light the way. I made copies of the deed and kept them close, a secret talisman that gave me strength on the days when the weight of invisibility threatened to crush me. This shift in perspective changed how I navigated my days. No longer willing to accept the subtle diminishment of my presence, I began to assert myself in small but meaningful ways. I spoke up during family conversations when before I had remained silent, even if my words were met with hesitation or dismissal. I insisted on maintaining certain routines that grounded me, preparing my own meals when possible, tending to my personal belongings with care, and carving out moments of solitude to reflect and recharge. These acts, seemingly ordinary, became profound expressions of self-respect and resistance. I also sought out allies, however unlikely they might seem. A neighbor who noticed the changes in me offered a listening ear and a word of encouragement. A local librarian helped me research my legal rights and options, quietly empowering me with knowledge I had long lacked. These connections, fragile as they were, reminded me that I was not alone in this journey and that support could be found in unexpected places. It was through these small acts of reaching out and claiming space that I began to rebuild a sense of community and belonging outside the confines of my fractured family. Perhaps most importantly, I started to nurture my own sense of worth beyond the roles I had been forced to play for so many years. I rediscovered old passions, reading books that challenged and inspired me, writing letters I never sent, and even considering the possibility of work or volunteer opportunities that would allow me to contribute and feel valued on my own terms. The act of imagining a life beyond mere survival was transformative. It planted seeds of possibility where once there had been only resignation. Yet, this newfound strength did not come without its own struggles. There were moments of doubt and fear, times when the pain of rejection threatened to overwhelm me, and the temptation to retreat into silence was strong. I wrestled with conflicting emotions, grief for what was lost, anger at those who had turned away, and a cautious optimism for what might still be. These internal battles were quiet but fierce, fought in the privacy of my thoughts and in the stillness of night. But each time I chose to face the uncertainty rather than flee from it, I felt my resolve deepen. This period of transformation was also marked by symbolic acts that affirmed my growing agency. I purchased a coat, an unassuming navy wool garment with deep pockets and a subtle pattern that became a metaphor for the armor I was putting on against the world's indifference. It was not just clothing, but a statement of presence and self-respect, a reminder that I was worthy of warmth, comfort, and protection. Wearing that coat as I stepped outside into the crisp air was like stepping into a new version of myself, one who refused to be invisible or voiceless. In the quiet moments, I allowed myself to imagine a future that was not defined by the pain of the past, but shaped by the choices I was beginning to make. It was a future where I could live on my own terms, surrounded by people who saw and valued me, and where my worth was measured not by the sacrifices I had made for others, but by the love and respect I gave myself. This vision was not naive or sentimental. It was grounded in the hard-won knowledge that freedom is often born from loss, and that healing is a journey rather than a destination. The midpoint of my story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, especially when faced with betrayal and exclusion by those we once trusted most. It is a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the possibility of renewal exists, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to seek it. For me, it was the moment when I stopped waiting for others to recognize my worth and began to claim it for myself, step by step, day by day. Though the path ahead remained uncertain and the wounds of the past still raw, I had taken the crucial first steps toward reclaiming my life. The journey was no longer about surviving, but about living, not about fading into the background, but about standing firmly in the light. This shift from victim to agent, from shadow to presence, set the stage for the next chapters of my story, chapters marked by confrontation, courage, and ultimately transformation. The second escalation in my story came not as a sudden storm, but as a gradual intensification of pressures that tested every ounce of the strength I had begun to reclaim. It was the moment when the past, which I thought I had left behind, reached out with cold fingers to pull me back into the shadows I was desperate to escape. This phase was marked by confrontations that were no longer subtle, by visits that carried the weight of expectation and judgment, and by messages, both spoken and unspoken, that challenged the fragile autonomy I had fought so hard to build. It was a time of reckoning, a series of moments when I had to stand firm against the tide of control and intrusion, knowing that to do so meant risking everything, but also gaining back what was truly mine. In the months following my quiet departure from the house where I had once hoped to find refuge, the world around me began to shift. I had settled into the modest boarding house, a place far removed from the sterile guest room that had felt like a prison, and found small comforts in routine and solitude. My days were marked by walks through unfamiliar neighborhoods, by new faces that offered kindness without pretense, and by the steady rhythm of a life slowly rebuilt on my own terms. I had found work in a small cafe, a job that demanded my presence and gave me purpose beyond the roles I had once inhabited. It was a life stripped of pretense, but rich in authenticity, a life where I was no longer a shadow, but a woman standing quietly in her own light. Yet, even as I began to breathe freely, the past refused to stay silent. The first sign was a letter slipped under the door of my small room one afternoon. It was from Kieran, my oldest grandchild, the one who had always reached out without hesitation, the one who still remembered the warmth of my presence and the comfort of my stories. His letter was a lifeline, filled with concern and longing, but it also carried the tremors of the family storm that raged behind the scenes. He wrote of the chaos at home, of the anger and confusion that my disappearance had sparked, and of his own hope that I was safe. His words were a balm to my weary heart and a reminder that, even amid rejection, threads of connection remained. Shortly after, the front door of the cafe where I worked swung open one rainy afternoon, and I saw her, Lisa, my daughter-in-law, standing there like a ghost from a life I was trying to leave behind. Her presence was sharp and unexpected, the air around her charged with a mixture of apology and accusation. Heather, my supervisor, whispered a warning, but I chose to face the moment with quiet strength. Lisa's eyes searched mine as she spoke, her voice low and hesitant, as if she were stepping carefully over fragile ground. She claimed panic and misunderstanding, spoke of the family's worry, and of their attempts to reach me that had gone unanswered. She brought with her an envelope, thick with contents that spoke of both practical concerns and veiled demands, a financial request for Kieran, a plea for reconciliation wrapped in careful words. It was the beginning of a slow, relentless push to pull me back into the roles I had shed: the compliant mother, the available grandmother, the silent participant in their carefully constructed lives. Adam, my son, soon followed with his own efforts. He sent letters marked by a brittle politeness that barely concealed frustration and disappointment. He hired a lawyer, Derek Sorensen, who arrived with formalities and legal language, speaking of well-being and next steps, trying to impose control under the guise of concern. These intrusions were more than mere reminders of my past. They were attempts to wrest power from me, to dictate the terms of my life, and silence my newfound independence. I met these advances with a calm that belied the storm they stirred within me. The lawyer's visit was a confrontation I had anticipated but not welcomed. He came to assess, to question, to insinuate that I was vulnerable and in need of their protection. I listened patiently, refusing to be cowed by his formal tone and carefully chosen words. When he suggested that a facility might be more suitable for me than the boarding house, I saw through the thin veneer of concern to the underlying desire to control and confine. I made it clear, firmly and without hesitation, that I was neither a pet to be managed nor a problem to be solved. My life was mine, and no one would decide otherwise without my consent. Alongside these confrontations came the public spectacle of the newspaper article that appeared in the community section of the local paper. It was a story framed by the family's voice, a carefully curated narrative of worry and loss that painted me as a missing matriarch, vulnerable and in need of rescue. The photograph used was from years ago, chosen to evoke sympathy rather than recognition. Reading the article, I felt a mixture of amusement and disgust. Their portrayal was a performance designed to elicit pity and justify their actions, but it failed to capture the truth of my experience, the years of invisibility, the betrayal, and the courage it took to walk away. This public airing of private matters brought mixed reactions. Some locals approached me with genuine concern, while others whispered behind their hands, drawn into the family drama like spectators at a play. Heather, at the cafe, brought the clipping with a quiet look of solidarity, reminding me that despite their stories, I was not alone. Arthur, a gentleman who had become a steady presence in my life, listened without judgment and offered quiet companionship that soothed the sting of isolation. Throughout this second escalation, I was forced to navigate a complex web of emotions: anger, sadness, fear, but also determination and hope. The pressures from my family sought to break my resolve, but each letter, each visit, each legal notice only strengthened my commitment to live on my own terms. I realized that their attempts to draw me back were as much about their need for control and appearances as they were about genuine concern. I was no longer willing to be a pawn in their game. In response, I took decisive steps to protect my autonomy. I engaged local legal counsel to ensure that my rights were recognized and that any further contact under the guise of concern would be met with clear boundaries. I wrote letters that were measured and firm, expressing my wishes without anger, but with unmistakable clarity. To Lisa, I sent a brief note, acknowledging the pain, but refusing to return to a life that had denied me dignity. To the lawyer, I stated unequivocally that there was no cause for further contact unless initiated by me. These acts were both shield and sword, defense against intrusion and assertion of my selfhood. Amidst these struggles, I found unexpected moments of grace and connection. The visits from Kieran became a source of light, a reminder that bonds could endure beyond conflict and that love, even when complicated, was still possible. Our conversations were gentle and unhurried, filled with memories and cautious hopes. I learned to cherish these moments as the fragile threads that held the tapestry of my new life together. As the second escalation unfolded, I became ever more aware that the fight was not simply against the family's attempts to control me, but against the societal expectations that too often render older women invisible, powerless, and voiceless. My journey was both deeply personal and painfully universal, a struggle for recognition, respect, and the right to define one's own life, regardless of age or circumstance. This phase tested my resilience in ways I had not anticipated. The emotional toll was heavy, but it also forged a strength and clarity that had been buried beneath years of accommodation and silence. I discovered that standing firm was not a single act of defiance, but a sustained commitment to self-respect and freedom. Each letter written, each boundary set, each moment of solitude claimed was a declaration that I would no longer be diminished or erased. The second escalation was a crucible, a time of challenge and transformation. It brought the past crashing into the present, forcing me to confront pain and betrayal head-on. But it also illuminated the path forward, a path marked by courage, dignity, and the unwavering belief that it is never too late to choose oneself. The journey was far from over, but in these moments of confrontation and clarity, I found the power to continue walking toward a life of my own making. The moment of climax in my journey arrived quietly, without fanfare or dramatic confrontation, but with the profound weight of finality and personal sovereignty. It was not a shouted declaration or a public spectacle, but a deliberate, measured act that sealed the boundaries I had struggled so long to establish and marked the true reclaiming of my life. This moment was the culmination of months of struggle, reflection, and painful decisions, a turning point where I moved beyond resistance and into the realm of self-definition, no longer waiting for permission or validation from those who had sought to diminish me. In the weeks leading up to this turning point, the pressure from my family had intensified, their messages growing more insistent and their visits more intrusive. Letters arrived with increasing frequency, their tone shifting from concern to veiled demands. My son's lawyer had come once again, this time with documents that suggested an evaluation of my mental and physical state, a thinly veiled attempt to question my capacity and justify intervention. It was a chilling reminder of how far they were willing to go to reclaim control, to rewrite the narrative of my life according to their terms. I read the papers with a steady hand, but a heart heavy with sorrow and determination. I understood then that the true power lay not in fighting their attempts with anger or resentment, but in asserting my will through calm, unyielding clarity. I began drafting a letter, not to plead, not to explain, but to close a chapter definitively. I addressed it first to the lawyer, making it clear that I was of sound mind and body, living in a safe and supportive environment of my own choosing, and that any further unsolicited contact would be considered harassment. I signed it with a steady hand, the pen feeling like an instrument of liberation rather than mere ink on paper. This letter was my shield and my sword, a legal and emotional barrier erected to protect the life I was building. Next, I turned my attention to the family members who had tried to hold me captive in a role that no longer fit. To Lisa, I wrote a brief but heartfelt note. I acknowledged the pain and confusion, the unspoken grief that had marked our fractured relationships. But I was resolute in my refusal to return to a life where I was invisible and voiceless. I told her plainly that I was not angry but done, that I would no longer wait for their acceptance or permission to live. This letter was not an accusation or a cry for reconciliation. It was a statement of finality, a clear boundary that could not be crossed. Sending these letters was an act of courage and release. I felt the weight of years lift, a burden I had carried silently beginning to fall away. Yet, with that release, came a profound sense of loneliness, a recognition that some doors would remain closed and some relationships forever altered. But I also felt a deep peace, a quiet strength that came from standing firmly in my truth and choosing myself, no matter the cost. Shortly after mailing the letters, Lisa made her unexpected appearance at the cafe where I worked. She stood at the entrance, stiff and out of place, a stark contrast to the familiar chaos of the morning rush. Heather, who had warned me of her arrival, offered a small nod of support, but I was determined to meet the moment on my own terms. Lisa's voice was low and tentative as she asked to speak privately. I led her to a booth in the back, a space away from prying eyes and ears. Our conversation was measured and fragile. Lisa expressed regret and explained the panic that had gripped the family, the fear of losing me completely. She spoke of misunderstandings and mistakes, of how they had been overwhelmed and unsure how to handle my absence. Her words were honest in a way I had not expected, stripped of the usual defenses and polished appearances. For a brief moment, the walls between us seemed to soften, but I was clear that forgiveness was not something I was ready to give. Not yet, and perhaps not ever. I told her that I was not her shadow, not a ghost to haunt their carefully arranged lives. I was a woman reclaiming her identity and her dignity. I was not returning to the roles they had cast me in, and I asked her to respect that choice. She left without finishing her coffee, the tension between us unresolved but acknowledged. That night, I sat on the porch with Joyce, the woman who had become my steadfast companion in this new chapter. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of rain and wood smoke, and the silence between us was comfortable and full of unspoken understanding. Joyce's quiet question, "You going to see them?" hung in the air. I shook my head, knowing that my path was no longer entwined with theirs, except perhaps in the delicate connection with Kieran, my grandchild, who had reached out with a different kind of love. The climax of my journey was not marked by reconciliation or grand gestures, but by the quiet assertion of boundaries and the reclamation of self. It was a moment when I stopped waiting for the past to change and instead chose to build a future on my own terms. I was no longer a victim or a shadow, but a woman who had learned to stand tall despite the fractures and losses. In the days that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. I continued working at the cafe, finding purpose in the steady flow of customers and the simple acts of service. I nurtured the friendships that had blossomed in this new environment, connections based on mutual respect and kindness rather than obligation or history. I wore the navy wool coat I had purchased months before with a renewed sense of pride, a symbol of the strength and warmth I now carried within myself. The letters I had sent were never met with further contact, and I understood that silence was their answer. But silence no longer frightened me. It was the space in which I could breathe, grow, and heal. The climax of my story was not an end, but a beginning, a turning point from which I stepped into a life defined not by the shadows of others, but by the light of my own choosing. This moment taught me that true power lies not in control over others, but in control over oneself. It showed me that freedom is born from acceptance of the past and courage to move beyond it. And it reminded me that no matter how deeply we are wounded or erased, there is always a way back to ourselves, if only we have the strength to take the first step. The resolution of my story unfolded not in a rush of grand reunions or dramatic reconciliations, but in quiet moments that held the weight of healing and acceptance. After the years of betrayal, rejection, and invisibility, I found peace not by returning to the past or seeking validation from those who had once turned away, but by embracing the life I had chosen for myself. It was a slow, steady process of rebuilding, not a restoration of what was lost, but the creation of something new, grounded in self-respect and quiet dignity. One of the most profound moments came when Kieran, my oldest grandchild, came to visit me. His presence was a balm to the wounds that had long festered in silence. He arrived with tentative steps, carrying nothing but a small bag and the hope of connection. Our reunion was simple, no tears, no heavy words, just the gentle warmth of two souls who had missed each other, but never lost the thread that bound them. We talked about everything and nothing, sharing memories, hopes, and the unspoken understanding that love could endure beyond the fractures of family drama. His willingness to see me as more than a shadow, more than a burden, was a quiet triumph, a sign that the future held space for healing even when the past had been painful. I wrote a letter to him afterward, a letter that was perhaps more for myself than for him. In it, I acknowledged the years of waiting and the long silence that had stretched between us. I told him that I had finally learned to hold my own heart with care, and that he had always been enough just by being himself. That letter was folded carefully and kept where I could see it, a reminder that even in the hardest journeys, there is grace to be found. The house where I lived had become a sanctuary, a place where I could finally rest from the battles fought and the roles imposed upon me. Joyce, my steadfast companion, remained by my side, a living testament to the power of quiet friendship and mutual respect. Together, we shared simple meals, laughter, and the comfort of knowing that we were no longer alone in the world. Our small rituals, cups of tea in the morning, walks through the neighborhood, quiet evenings on the porch, became the threads that wove a new tapestry of belonging. Though the letters I sent to my family had not been met with responses, and though Lisa's brief visit remained the last direct contact, I felt no bitterness. I understood that sometimes love means letting go, that freedom requires boundaries, and that healing is not always about mending old ties, but about creating new paths. I had not lost them. They had chosen to let go, and in turn, I had let go as well. This mutual release was painful but necessary, a final cut that allowed me to step fully into my own life. In time, I found joy in the small things: a well-brewed cup of coffee, a book that stirred my imagination, the sound of birdsong at dawn. I took pride in my work at the cafe, where faces grew familiar and smiles were genuine. The navy wool coat I had bought months before remained my favorite, a symbol not just of warmth, but of the resilience and grace I carried within me. Wearing it, I felt the quiet strength of a woman who had endured much, but refused to be defined by pain or loss. One evening, as I sat on the porch, wrapped in a soft blanket with Joyce beside me, I wrote a letter, not to the family or the lawyer, but to myself. It was a letter of acknowledgement and celebration, a reminder that I had waited too long for someone else to save me, and that in truth, I had always held the key. I wrote that they had let go first, but I had finally let go back, and in that mutual release, a new life had opened before me. I taped the letter inside my dresser drawer, a secret testament to the journey I had traveled and the woman I had become. This story is not just mine, but belongs to every woman who has felt unseen, unheard, or unworthy. It is a reminder that it is never too late to choose yourself, to step out of the shadows and to claim your place in the world. If this story finds you at the right moment, know that your voice matters, your presence is essential, and your life is yours to live fully and freely. The final chapter of my journey is one of quiet triumph, of resilience forged in the fires of betrayal and healed in the stillness of self-acceptance. It is a story of moving forward, not by returning to what was lost, but by embracing what can be gained when we choose to stand tall in our own light. And as I look out from the window of my modest home, the navy coat hanging by the door and the soft hum of life around me, I know that this life, imperfect, humble, and fiercely mine, is enough. It is more than enough.